Welcome to FarmSource Seasonal Focus, created as a way to share knowledge and advice on the season ahead. We're vets, agronomists, vendor reps, our team of technical sales reps, and sustainable dairy advisors, but most importantly, fellow farmers, share their insights in an easily digestible way.
Welcome to the second episode in the autumn season of FarmSource's Seasonal Focus, where we are talking about worm burdens and how to manage on farm. Now, we don't want to fear disease resistance in dairy cattle across New Zealand being a prevalent problem. However, we also know that there is a lot of tools in the toolkit that we can use. And so therefore, we're joined by Fonterra's Senior Veterinary Manager, Michael Shallcrass, to continue the conversation. Michael, let's talk about the fact, do you think dairy farmers in New Zealand do tend to over-drench just to be safe?
It's a risk. So as a general rule, I think adult sheep and cattle don't need drenching unless they're showing signs of clinical disease. By 18, 20 months of age, they've built up a pretty good natural resistance to parasites. And so what you need to focus on is how are you managing burdens in your young stock, and how are you preventing or trying to minimize the level of parasite burden on the pasture, and then also how do you minimize the number of infective larvae that the young stock are eating. So some of those things, so that the only way you can really control the worms once they're in the calves is through drenching, but the way that you regulate infective larval stages on pasture and ingestion, those are to do with management strategies. So there's a whole lot of other things that play into this that aren't, it's about a lot more than just drenching.
Yeah, so in terms of the life cycle, it's also must be a lot to do with your grazing management. And so therefore, is there an ideal type length that you should be being quite careful with those susceptible stock?
So the larvae themselves, they tend to live in the base of the sward. So if you're grazing down really hard, your animals are going to be eating more worms. That's inevitable, because there are worms in all the pasture all over the country. We're not going to stop that from happening, but we can change the way we graze our stock to reduce the number of parasites there. So not grazing down too hard, keep your residuals long. People do talk about spelling pasture, so leaving it and hoping that the worms will die off. Now, unless you're leaving it for at least 3 months, you're probably not going to see a reduction in larval levels in the pasture. They are quite hardy once they're in the environment. They will be susceptible to cold. So temperatures below 10, temperatures below 0, that's good. Good way of killing, not just worms, but other bugs in the pasture. And some of the species are more susceptible to drying out than others, but they will find shady areas, they will find dung pats to hide in, and they can survive for months to years. Spelling pasture, if you can do it for a long time, you may get some reduction there, but it's not particularly effective.
So that's not so ideal. Very pesky little creatures.
They certainly are.
And what about in the drought? I'd naturally think that would be an ideal time to drench if its pastures are getting low. And
they're more likely to be eating lower down. Yeah. Again, if you've got adult stock, it's probably no need to drench them. The conditions that are really good for growing worms are warm and wet. Similar to the conditions that are good for growing mushrooms or other pastoral fungus. And so we do tend to see pasture levels peaking in autumn and spring. Once we start to warm up after winter and again in the autumn, and that's probably also in part because you've got young stock who are eating more grass, and they will be shedding more worms as a result. A good way to clean your pasture up or to reduce the worm burden in a particular paddock is to cross graze if you can, ideally with a different species, because the worms that infect cattle don't infect sheep. So if you've got that ability and certainly sheep and beef farmers obviously do, you can clean up the sheep parasites by putting some cows through. You can clean up the cow parasites by putting some sheep through. And the other way of doing it is using adult stock. So graze your young stock rotationally. If you're rotationally grazing your young stock, put them through first. Send onto relatively clean pasture, and then the adult animals come through afterwards and clean up whatever's been shed by the young stock.
Right. And talking about pasture species, anything in particular that stands out that's better for young stock to be going on?
So non-grass crops tend to be poorer environments for parasites to live in. They've often been recently cultivated, so that cultivation process will kill off any worms that are there. But they're also much less dense. Things like like a summer crop or a chicory or something like that. They have better airflow. They're more open. They tend not to graze as the grazing behaviour is different of the animals there, which means their exposure to the worms is reduced, and the worms find it harder to survive in those environments. And that holds true for new grass as well. So again, because it's been cultivated, that paddock, all the worms that were there have been killed.
Okay, and let's talk about treatment and how to identify the right time for treatment. Is it about selecting based on age, or is it to do with how to get ahead of the curve?
So I think I said in episode 1 that all pasture in New Zealand will have some worms in it. And as soon as animals are grazing pasture, and in a sort of sheep and beef situation, that's from birth. In a dairy situation, it's once they go out onto grass, whenever an individual farmer chooses to do that, they will be ingesting worms. And it takes about 3 weeks for most worm species to go from being eaten to new eggs being shed by that animal. So you need to think about your strategy here. From as soon as they're eating grass, they're at risk, basically, or that there will be some subclinical effects of parasitism. And how do you decide when to treat? And I think a lot of farmers either kind of do it by rote. They go, oh yeah, once the animals are eating grass, I drench them every month. The young stock, I drench the calves every month.
And that's what I do every year.
And it's because it's what I've done. And I think there are some risks there that they're drenching more than they need to. So they're spending money they didn't have to spend. And every time that you treat an animal with a drench, you increase that risk of drench resistance developing. The other strategy that I've certainly seen people use is they wait until there are clinical signs. So they wait until they see animals scouring. And I think the risk with that is, twofold. One is if they're scouring because of parasitism, you've already had all those subclinical losses up to that point, and you're now seeing clinical disease, and so you're too late. You probably should have been drenching weeks earlier. But also, there are lots of things that cause animals to scour. It's not, worms is one of them, but it's definitely not the only reason. And the first thing, if I saw some animal scouring, I wouldn't necessarily reach for the drench as my first treatment option for that.
What would you reach for?
I'd do some diagnostics first.
Yes.
You talk to someone, you go, if you think that it could be worms, then you can test the animals, but you can also look at the risk factors. If you've got animals that have been going on to clean pasture, they were drenched relatively recently, maybe they've been cross-grazed with some other species, then the risk, the chance of it being worms causing the scour is probably reasonably low. And so you would need to then think about, is it a bacterial infection? Is it some other kind of parasite? Is it crypto or giardia or something like that?
I'm going to be honest, I can understand why farmers just get in that routine, because it takes a lot to try and understand. I mean, there is a long list of different things to manage risk, but it's at the same time too, you don't want to leave it too late, as you said there, when it gets to a clinical perspective. Is there any types of resources or tools that farmers can look at and assess if it's the right time to drench, as opposed to just reaching for it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it is complicated. This is a complicated topic,
Yeah.
and there is a really good initiative called Wormwise that's put together by Beef and Lamb, MPI, and the New Zealand Veterinary Society, and that's www.wormwise.co.nz, I think, something like that. That's a really simple document that explains all of the different competing factors that go into parasite management. But there is no one-size-fits-all simple fix for this. Every farm is different. Every season is different. Every class of stock within that farm is different in terms of their risk profile for being infected and contributing to the development of resistance.
And then also something that's very important too, when you do make that decision to drench, that the dosage is based on weight. It's not just 10 mil for everyone.
Yeah, the general recommendation is if you look at a mob of animals, you drench to the heaviest animal in the mob to make sure that no one's getting underdosed, because that's a significant contributor to resistance. But you also... people can be surprised that their iometer is not as accurate as they think it is, and I think a good practice would be to have some scales. That's good practice in general for raising young stock, but also weigh a dozen animals first and drench off the heaviest weight there. If you find you've got a mob with a significant weight variation, then maybe you need to look at trying to drench them, divide them in two and go, these are the heavy ones, these are the light ones, we're going to drench them at different rates. But it's important to make sure you're not underdosing.
Is there any particular times of the year that people are drenching that you wish they wouldn't?
Not necessarily. Again, it does depend on individual farm factors. Probably the one that the one that's of concern is whole herd drenching of adult cattle, because that doesn't, all the parasites that it'll kill most of their parasites if they've got any, but they probably don't need drenching. But all the worms that survive are resistant, and if you've got a whole herd, suddenly all the worms that they produce over the next few weeks are resistant ones, that will accelerate the rate of development of resistance quite significantly. So again, one of the strategies that you can use is to not drench 10% of the herd, for example. And I don't know how you choose that 10%, 10 healthiest percent. And because that will dilute out the resistance genes that those cattle or animals are shedding onto the pasture.
And when it does come to selecting the right drench, is there some particular things that farmers should be paying attention to on the back of the label, or advice that they should be getting from their vets?
If you're concerned about the development of resistance, then you should always use a combination drench. Now, whether it's 2 or 3 or 4 actives, that's probably going to come down to cost and practicality. But even then, if you have resistance on your farm, that combination drench may not be effective. And so it is, I think, really important to talk to someone about making a more holistic parasite management plan. It's not just about the drench. The drench is an important part of it, particularly for animals that are infected, and you want to clear them out. But how do you then reduce the risk of them getting infected again, or getting infected significantly again? Keeping in mind, we're never going to kill all the parasites. They're always going to be there. We're always going to have to manage them. If we aren't careful with how we manage our drenches, we could end up in a situation where they're not there as an option.
It's very similar to human analogies in so many ways as well, in terms of a holistic health approach, as opposed to always ending up in hospital and relying on the drugs once we
and probably a similar thing in humans is the rise of antibiotic resistance, where people blame the overuse of antibiotics for increased in number of infections that can't be easily treated. But it's not the overuse, it's any use. And that's the thing to keep in mind is every time you use these, there is a risk, these products, so drenches or antibiotics, there's a risk that the things that you're trying to kill, some of them will survive, some of those ones will have survived because they're resistant to the drugs. And if they go on to thrive, then it's going to be harder to treat next time.
So what I'm taking out of it is that drench is the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, and that monitoring and managing is very much the first port of call.
Yeah, from a kind of a farm efficiency perspective, if you're waiting until you see signs of disease, you've already lost. You're already behind from a production perspective, because the vast majority of the economic impact of parasites is in that subclinical phase. And so monitoring your growth rates of your stock is so important there to pick up the ones who are falling behind, selectively drench them, and hopefully that reduces the amount of drench that you've got to use, and the rise of resistance in the worms that are left behind.
Well, thanks, Michael. I've learned so much in this episode. Michael Shellcrass is Senior Veterinary Manager for Fonterra. And of course, if you're seeking more information on this, of course, talk to your local farm source TSR, as well as, of course, your local vet and the Wormwise website, wormwise.co.nz for more information.
Thanks for watching Farm Source Seasonal Focus. If you want to know more about the content featured in this episode, contact your local technical sales rep or talk to our store staff.